Hi everyone and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be looking at skill 1, which is standard English conventions. So the reason I picked this is because it's easier to tackle these type of questions. They have shorter question lengths and it's easier to gain more marks. So let's get right into it. So as you can see here, our first question says, a recent study tracked the number of bee species present in 27 New York apple orchards over a 10-year period. Dash found that when wild growth near an orchard was cleared, the number of different bee species visiting the orchard decreased, and which choice completes the text which conforms to the standard conventions. And we can see different punctuations in each of the options, and they're asking us to pick the right one. So with these kind of questions, what I've noticed in the SAT, the pattern is they don't want you to actually add any punctuation, especially when there's a name, because the name is important to the overall coherence of the paragraph. And here you can see that if you took out the name and if you just had entomologist, the entomologist found that when wild growth near an orchard was cleared, it's not as specific as giving the name. And you also don't need to have any commas between the name, saying it's non-essential when it is essential. It also doesn't make sense to say entomologist had their crab and then have a colon and then found that when wild just doesn't work. So you would go immediately for C. And as I said, as a general tip, whenever you see names, more often than not, it should just be the clearest one. So option C with no punctuation. All right, now moving on to question 2. It says, on April 5th, 1977, Kitty Cohn and 150 other disability rights activists entered a San Francisco federal building. After pleading for years to no effect for the passage of key anti-discrimination legislation, blank until their demands were addressed. Finally, on April 28th, the legislation was signed. So those of you guys who watched the first video know that this is a modifier placement question. So what we can see right before that dash, it says, after pleading for years for the passage of key anti-discrimination legislation, and then it gives you a word right after. So what they want you to essentially do is they want you to find the word that they were describing. So who is the one that has been pleading for years for the passage of key anti-discrimination legislation? Option A says pressure at the beginning, B says the sit-in, C says lawmakers, D says the activists. So immediately we know it's either C or D because that's the only people that we have in the options. We know that lawmakers are not the ones that are pleading for years, and we know right here that it was activists because that's what it says right at the beginning. On April 5th, the activists entered a San Francisco building. So we know that D is the correct modifier because D is what is essentially being described previous to the dash. Okay, so now I'm moving right to question 5, just to keep the video short. So here it says, professional American football player Fred Cox invented one of the world's most popular toys. In the 1970s, he came up with the idea for the Nerf football, which blank of the harder and heavier regulation football. So here we can see the tenses are different in the options. It says were, are, were, is. So my tip with these kind of questions is really to find the object. So in this case, it's the Nerf football. And then replace that with either they or it. And then using that pronoun, put that back into the option and see what matches the best so you can get to the correct option. So here, for example, the Nerf football is singular, so you can say it. And then you know that the only option that makes sense in this context would be option D, which is, because you can only say it is a smaller foam version. For example, if I had they is wouldn't make sense. So I can immediately go and pick option A or C in that case if it had been they. But for this question, the correct answer is D. So definitely find the right pronouns and then match them up, and obviously check for whether it's singular or plural to get to the correct option. Okay, so moving on to our last question, it says, when external forces are applied to common glass made from silicates, energy builds up around minuscule defects in the material, resulting in fractures. Recently, engineer Erkka Frankberg of Tampere University in Finland used the chemical blank to make a glassy solid that can withstand higher strain than silicate glass can before fracturing. So again, in this case, we are given the punctuation differences. And if you remember the very first question we had a look at, or the one in the beginning of this video, you don't want to use commas and you don't want to use anything that will obscure the clarity of what you're trying to say. So here we can see right at the beginning of the paragraph, there's this build up towards aluminium oxide. It says external forces, a glass, this, that, there's a description. So it wouldn't make sense to skip that name or to put 2 commas around it, suggesting that it's non-essential. So for the coherence as well as the fit for this paragraph, the correct option would be D, compound aluminum oxide with no commas around it, since it's very important to the paragraph and it's not non-essential. So again, remember my tip that you always need to you don't need punctuations in these kind of questions usually, especially if you think that it can actually clarify what is being said. Okay, so that is it for today's video because I wanted to keep it short. I wanted to just keep it crisp and teach the questions that are the most important. In my real slides, I had 4 or 5 more questions, but I will maybe add that in the next video. So do come back and check the next video out. I'll be posting videos weekly until this series is over. And definitely subscribe and like the video if you learned something new from here. See you next time.